everyone, hope all of you are doing super well and welcome back. In this video, I'll be giving you some information on the knowledge area in strategy analysis, which is defining the future state. So there are a couple of knowledge areas if you don't know what strategy analysis is and if you don't know how to define the current state, I've taken videos on that. I will add the links in the description box. So I suggest if you don't know what strategy analysis is and if you have not gone through the current state video, take a look at that and then come to the future state because then it would be much more easy to understand. So without any delay, let's get into it. So what is the purpose of defining a future state? Okay, so we have a current state. You need to do some change in order to, achieve a business need. So at that time, you need to define a future state so that you can identify where is the gap and how you can, you know, um, put down a strategy and the transition states to achieve that future goal. So the purpose of a future state definition is to determine the set of necessary conditions to meet the business need. Okay, we have a need, so how do we meet those conditions? So it's not required that you have to put down this future state in detail and in a way that it needs to support any implementation or development, but it does need certain amount of information so that it can enable the entire team to make the right decisions. So, as a business analyst, you need to ensure that the future state of the enterprise is well defined. Okay, the future state should be achievable with the resources that are available at hand, and also the future state should be clear enough and well defined so that all the key stakeholders will be able to come to a shared consensus vision of the outcome. So it shouldn't be very abstract and very uncertain and fuzzy. It needs to be well defined. Okay, the next one is, there are, as I said, it needn't be too much in detail, but of course there needs to be certain amount of details which needs to be as part of the future state. So the future state should allow for competing strategies to achieve the future state to be identified and accessed. So to achieve a future state, there could be multiple strategies that could enable us to achieve that future state. So the future state should be very well defined so that we can identify which would be the right strategy to achieve that. And also, the future state should define a clear definition of the outcome. Only when we know the outcome, we'll be able to understand and define the right strategies. Also, it should define the details of the scope of the solution space. Only when we know the exact scope, we'll be able to play around and we'll be able to identify the right solutions. Also, it should allow for value associated with the future state to be assessed. So the future state should very well be defined in a way that we will be able to understand what value is it bringing, because if there's no value, then we don't even have to change anything which is as the current process, or there's no change required. It also needs to enable consensus to be achieved among key stakeholders, which I mentioned earlier. Also, you need to define the new or the removed or modified components of the enterprise. So as part of a change that you're going to bring about to achieve a future state, you might add on, you might update, or you might remove certain components from that entire cycle or that process. So that needs to be well defined. Also, you should include changes to the boundaries of an organization itself. So probably the organization might be entering into a new industry. So in that case, your boundary is being extended, okay? Or you might want to go into a different service line. So all this needs to be added as part of the future state. And it also might include specific metrics or loosely defined results. So why do we want to have these loosely defined results or metrics? Because when we have certain metrics, we'll be able to quantitatively, we'll be able to do a comparison between what was the existing performance or the metrics versus what was the proposed one, so that we know how far have we provided value to the organization. Okay, so keep in mind to include all these details when you define the future state. So defining a future state, you need the business requirements as an input, and with certain guidelines and tools, you will be able to define the future state. And as part of the output of this future state, what you have defined, you will be able to come up with the business objectives, you will be able to come up with the future state description, as well as you will be able to identify what is the potential value of that future state. So some of the guidelines and tools that you can use to define the future state is, the first one is constraints. So you would want to understand what are the different constraints that are going to be associated to the change that you are performing, based on which you'll be able to identify the strategy. The next one, as I mentioned, you need to have a clear definition of the current state. Only then you would know what needs to be achieved, what is the desired state, and you would be able to identify the gaps. The next one is metrics and key performance indicators. As I said, KPIs. It's very important to have metrics of the current state so that you would be able to anticipate and come up with the desired future state as well as the metrics. And the last one is organizational strategy. So, as I said, every organization has a strategy, goals, and objectives and visions. Whatever you're doing as part of the future state, you always need to make sure that it is in alignment with the organization goals and objectives and strategy as well. So now when you're defining the future state, generally the business, you need to consider business goals and objectives. So future state can be described in terms of business objectives or goals. So you would say in future this is something that I want to achieve. So it's more of an objective and a goal. So what is the difference between these objectives and goals? So a goal, there are long-term, ongoing and qualitative statements of a state or condition that the organization is seeking to establish and maintain. So some examples of goal is to improve safety, increase revenue. So all these are qualitative, okay? There's no any quantitative measures added to it. But if you want to go in detail, so high level goals are more qualitative, but you can go more in detail, such as, let's say the high level one is increasing the number of high revenue customers. If you want to go in detail, you can mention it as increased number of high revenue customers in the 30 to 45 age bracket by 30% within 6 months. So you're being very descriptive, you're being very definite and detailed about what exactly you want to achieve. When you look on the other hand to objectives, goals, they are analyzed, they are converted into more descriptive and granular and specific objectives. Okay, they are linked to measures that make it possible to objectively assess if the objective has been achieved. Okay, when you want to be more descriptive, granular and specific, then you can define it as an objective, and indirectly this objective will tie back to a goal. So every goal would have a set of objectives where you keep meeting that in order to achieve that goal. And also, when you either want to define a goal or an objective, make sure that those goals and objectives are smart. Okay, so if you don't know what smart is, I've taken a video on that as well. So basically, you need to have all your goals and objectives which is very smart, which is specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and needs to be time bound as well. So that's about how you want to define the future state using goals and objectives. The next one is you want to check on the scope of the solution space. So to identify which is going to be the right strategy to achieve that future state, we need to look into certain different dimensions so that we can come up with the right strategy. And we had seen this already in the as part of the current state when we define the current state. So the organization structure, culture, capabilities and processes, technology and infrastructure policies, the business architecture, internal assets and external influencers. You need to look at all these different dimensions and perspectives when you're trying to identify the best strategy and the scope of the solution space. So let's look at this in detail. So first one, constraints. Keep in mind that constraints may reflect any one of these following. It could be any constraint which the organization might be having. Okay, it could be budgetary restrictions, time restrictions, the technology infrastructure policies, the number of resources that are available at hand, the restrictions which are based on the skills of the team, stakeholders. Could be a requirement that certain stakeholders may not be affected by the implementation or the solution, compliance, regulatory and any other restriction. You need to consider all these constraints when you're defining the future state, because if you don't consider these constraints, it's going to go a waste of effort and value. The next one is organizational structure and culture. So there are certain elements of the organization structure and culture that may need to change to support a future change. So let's say there is some process that had been done manually. Okay, now you want to automate the process because you want to save time and you want to, you want to result in more um, outputs. So people might be very accustomed to that manual task, and some people might fear that if that work is going to be automated, they might not have any work and they might lose their job. So there needs to be a little bit of a cultural change or mindset change. Okay, or let's say that you want to constantly keep taking in customer feedback and then you want to keep improvising on the product. Organizations may not be ready for change, so that very change mindset needs to be as part of the culture. So all this needs to also be taken into consideration when you want to define the future state. You also need to describe the components of the future state, which provides insights into the potential conflicts, impacts and limits, okay, which might be encountered. The next one is capabilities and processes. So, as I mentioned, capability, every organization would have a set of capabilities and processes. Okay. So, when you're looking at a future state, you want to identify what are all the different new kinds of activities or capabilities, processes, or the changes I need to bring in the way some activities are being executed or are performed. What are all these different changes that I need to bring about in order for the organization to realize the future state? So, even keep looking at capabilities, processes, activities, tasks as well. The next one is technology, infrastructure, and policies. So, if current technology or the infrastructure and policies are insufficient to meet the business needs, then the business analyst identifies the changes necessary for the desired future state. So, let's say that the future state requires to follow certain policies, it needs certain technology, it also needs to implement that technology, you need certain amount of infrastructure. So currently if you don't have any of these, you might want to identify what are all the different technologies, infrastructures, what are all the policies that need to be put into action in order to achieve that future state. So this is another dimension. The next one is the business architecture. Okay, so the enterprise has an architecture. Okay, and when you come up with a future state, you always need to make sure that that future state is in alignment as well as it integrates into the business architecture and it is not in isolation. So whatever is being done in an enterprise, it needs to be aligned with the business architecture. Okay, anything outside that is totally out of scope and we can call it as misaligned with the business. Okay, so you need to identify and see that that future state supports and integrates with this business architecture. The next one is internal assets and the identifying assumptions. So first one is the internal assets. The assessment of existing and needed resources is considered when performing a feasibility analysis on possible solution approaches for the change. Okay, you need to understand what are all the different assets you have. It could be all the resources, it could be tangible, it could be intangible, but you need to consider what are all the internal assets that you have and see whether anything else is needed as part of the change strategy. Okay, you need to see if those resources and assets they can be considered when you're performing a feasibility analysis on the possible solution. Okay, next one is identifying assumptions. These assumptions must be identified and clearly understood so that appropriate decisions can be made if assumptions later proves invalid. So this is very interesting. When you define a future state, some things might be very unclear. Oh, if you're very definite and very clear, well and good. Sometimes there might be certain areas which are not very clear, and in those areas, there would be certain assumptions that are being made. So you need to identify what are all the different assumptions that were made in order to achieve that future state. And you just don't leave it once you have identified those assumptions. What you have to do is you have to make appropriate decisions, okay, as to what needs to be done if those assumptions are going to be invalid. What if it doesn't work out as we expected? Then what needs to be done? So, as part of identifying, you also need to come up with some decisions on what needs to be done when they become invalid. The last one is you need to identify the potential value. Okay. The potential value of the future state is the net benefit of the solution after operating costs are accounted for. So once you've implemented the entire future state, you have put in some investments. So you need to check what is the net benefit of the solution after all the operating costs are accounted. Okay. So when you define this future state, business analysts need to consider increase or decrease potential value. Sometimes the value can increase, but sometimes you put in over engineering and then the value tends to only decrease. Okay. So you need to consider the external opportunities revealed in assessing external influences. Okay. What are all the external opportunities? Okay, that exist as part of doing external, you would want to check what are all your external influencers. So as part of doing that, you want to check what are all going to be the external opportunities, what could be the new technologies or knowledges that could be gained as part of this future state, what could be potential loss of a competitor in a market. Okay, so when the one thing I want to say is, when you define this future state, okay, it's not going to be fixed, it's not going to be static, not everything is going to be the same till you achieve that future state. There could be so many external influences that have happened, people, competitors coming in the market, things happening in the market, regulations, laws, everything might change sometimes. Okay, so you need to assess all that, and in the end you want to come up with the potential value. So you would want to check the pros, okay, of what are the external opportunities, where could I start investing in, where could I start monetizing on. Okay, what are all the unknown strengths of the new partners which I can start utilizing, which I can start using, and then the new technologies that I could wrap up on, the knowledge that I could gain. When I say I, it's the enterprise. Okay, so looking on the flip side, things that could decrease potential value is, you try to do something, but in that time there might be a new competitor coming in the market which totally overtakes what you have done. That could lead to potential loss. You have already invested so much of time, effort, and cost. Everything goes to a loss. And then mandated adoption of a change component. So let's say the government or some regulations, policies, rules are come out newly. So you might need to wrap up and you might want to be compliant with those new changes. So it might need again certain changes happening. So it could lead to potential loss. So always future state, you need to consider the increase or decreased potential value. Okay. So in addition to the potential value of the future state, this analysis should consider the acceptable level of investment to reach the future state. So you have analyzed, okay, these are all the possible increased value and decreased values that could happen. In the end, all this information needs to be taken and seen whether, even after me putting an investment, is the value going to be positive or negative. Based on that, you can see if you want to go ahead with that change, if you want to invest in that change in order to reach the future state. So generally, if it's going to be a very low value and you're only going to go on a loss, or if it's not worth it, then sometimes this idea or this might be dropped or paused. Okay, so these are the different aspects that you need to consider when you're defining a future state, and look into these different areas which I had mentioned. It will be very helpful. So if you like this video, please do give this a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed, please do subscribe to this channel, and also do share your feedbacks. Thank you.